I'm going to do today is present a little bit. So I know you all read a paper by Federica Fusi and I, and what I'm going to do is present sort of a broader presentation of the overall project I've been working on for the last 10 years, which is interested in understanding technology use in government in the United States. It's a multi-year project, and so the paper you read is from 1 year of that project, but I'm going to sort of talk more broadly about the project in general. So, and I will talk a little bit, not just about the project, but what we've learned over the last 10 years by doing this project. So we set out with this idea that we wanted to study technology use in government that did not focus on sort of high-level national federal initiatives, because the US is quite decentralized in its management. And so from doing 10 years of this research, which at the time seemed really new and groundbreaking, I would assert that US local governments are really falling behind in technology use compared to other developed nations, that managers in the US system play a really critical role in technology enactment, both sort of adoption, implementation, use, and integration. And that moving forward, I think one of the things I've been thinking about a lot is the need for research in public administration in particular, which I think most of you are within this sort of broad field of government studies, public administration, public policy, that we really need to be thinking about research that focuses on the social construction of technology use in government, because I think people in our field tend to not do that kind of work very much. So I'm going to weave through some descriptions about the project I've been working on, and then also some of my broad conclusions that will maybe seem like sweeping statements, but they do come from sort of a lot of sort of data-based research and smaller papers. So this study has sort of two focuses, right, that are really important to think about when you think in a comparative sense. I know this audience is very international, right? So it's definitely a US context, and I think the US is quite different in the way that its government is structured, sort of in an instrumental way, and then how they utilize technology. And also that this study is really focused on understanding how the managerial role in technology, so not just what the devices are like or how citizens use technology, but how the organization and the management within government agencies is thinking about technology and using it. So I think that when we think about the US, we often have this idea that it's sort of leading in innovation and technology, and certain parts of American society and government really are quite advanced from a technology standpoint. We have sort of big investments in research and development, big investments in science and technology at universities. We have a culture that really values sort of innovation, right? Rather than responding to the needs of people during COVID-19, we focus more on developing a vaccine, right? So I think there is a cultural sort of approach in the US to really be at the cutting edge and to think about innovation at the forefront. We also have a federal government that has had a very sort of public stance on technology, big data, open government. Obama had some big open government plans that he touted as president. Donald Trump obviously has a very strong presence on social media. And so one of the things that comes from this cultural presentation in the United States is, I think, an assumption that US government is very innovative and at the cutting edge of technology use, when in reality, the federal government has these sort of branches that are very advanced, but there's not a sort of lot of deeply embedded innovation throughout government, and in particular when you move down to the state and the local levels. And so I would argue that in the US, we sort of have this facade of innovation that doesn't translate sort of through the entire system in the way that it does in more centralized governments or in smaller nations like Estonia, Denmark, even Germany, right, which is a highly populated nation compared to other European nations, but is still much sort of smaller than the United States. So that, again, that's like a sweeping statement, but I can answer questions in more detail about that when we're done if you'd like. So one of the things when I started this project in 2010 was that we actually knew very little about e-government in smaller localities in the United States. So how do sort of local governments, and when we say local government in the US, we mean sort of city government, county government, and sometimes state entities that are operating at a local level. There isn't a lot of research on that. Most of the research in the United States focuses at the federal level or on really large cities like Seattle and Chicago and LA and big programs that are happening in urban centers. So we decided to develop a national study on technology use in US municipalities. So one of the challenges with this is sort of deciding which kinds of cities we would study. So there are like, I want to say there's around 4,000 cities in the United States. There's a lot, right? And a lot of them are very small. So when we talk about small cities in the US, we usually are referring to cities under 50,000 would be considered small. One of the problems with studying very small localities in the US is they tend to not have very much government, right? They don't have a lot of sort of formal infrastructure for government. So we decided we would look at cities that were over a population of 25,000. This ensured that we had sort of managerial structures and agencies within cities that were well defined. Communities of 20,000 and less tend to have sort of part-time governments or part-time political leadership. And we excluded cities over 250,000 because those larger cities like Phoenix and Chicago and Miami tend to get a lot of attention in the research. There's a lot of case studies on big cities. So when we looked at the population of the number of cities within this population group, it's about 2,000. And so we didn't want to survey 2,000. So we decided we would draw a sample of 500 US municipalities. The idea being that we know there's a lot of variation across the US, and so we want to capture cities in different states, cities with different populations, and cities sort of across the political and ethnic and racial sort of spectrum in the United States. This might not be the kind of approach you would take studying municipalities in other types of countries, but the US really has a lot of sort of geographic and political and structural variation. So this is a visualization of the cities we ended up pulling in the random sample. And so you'll see, right, that there are clusters in these areas where we have more population, right? So if you think about how random sampling occurs, you should be drawing more cities in areas where there are more cities. So for example, this is Wyoming, this is where I'm from. It has a population of about 500,000. So we ended up drawing my hometown, which is a city of about 50,000. Montana only has one city in it. Idaho has 3, right, that were drawn in the sample. But then we have a large set of cities from California, Florida, and the northeast region of the country where there's more population. So we're looking at these cities, and we draw 500, and we spent a lot of time thinking about what kinds of people we wanted to study. So we decided to identify 5 people in every city that we would survey. So we chose these 5 agencies because these are the 5 sort of government structures that actually exist in all cities in America. So we also selected these organizations because we did not want to study IT managers and technology experts. We were really interested in understanding how technology is used by sort of what I would call like everyday managers. So this ends up being our survey study. We implement the survey every other year. And each year we include a set of survey items that stay the same. So we ask about general technology use. We ask some questions about organizational structure, centralization, some sort of management themes. And then we picked a different topic every year based on some of the interests students had. So we asked a lot about transparency in the first year, then social media, security and privacy, data sharing. And in 2018, the last year we did the survey, we asked about personal technology use. Because we were interested in understanding how younger managers who might use technology more in their day-to-day lives would be more open to using technology in the workplace. 3 years of the study, we collected website data. So we scraped the websites of the 500 cities. And you can sort of see our response rate was declining over time, which is probably why we will stop doing the survey moving forward. The project has resulted in gobs of papers. These are some examples. Some of the papers focus more on management. Some of them focus a lot more on technology. You read one for today. My point in showing this slide is just that we've covered a lot of sort of ground in this study. And because we're looking at the same cities over time, we're able to, I think, draw some broader conclusions about technology use in the US. So as I've already mentioned, the contribution of this study is that we focus on small cities. We look at people who are not IT experts. It's somewhat multi-method, and the study's done over time. So our broadest conclusion is that US cities are really falling behind in technology use. And so this leads me to be interested in a lot of questions about how country context shapes e-government, right? I spend a lot of time in Europe. Some of you I've met. And many of you live in countries that have really moved forward a lot in e-government and technology. And I think some of the differences have a lot to do with cultural views about technology use, and then the actual structure of government and how technology is implemented. So in the United States, for example, we don't even have a formal agreement on how city websites, like what domain they should use. So in our study, 31% of the cities use .us as their domain site, but about 5% use .net, 15% use .com because they think it makes them sound more business-like. Some use .gov, right? So this is a really simple thing, but it, I think, demonstrates the lack of consistency and the lack of sort of centralization in the US, which then permeates all the different types of technology we use in our government organizations. US cities are increasingly using technology. I think some of this is just the function of time and maturity, but we're not using technology at the rate that most European cities are using technology. For example, we find that e-services, right, this is the most basic form of technology use. So being able to make requests online, being able to deliver records online. We see a real uptick in these uses from 2010 to 2016. And this should be expected. But as you can see, they've become so widespread, we've sort of stopped asking about them on the survey because everybody uses them. We see some changes in social media use. Facebook, we see it increasing from 2012 to 2016. We see increases in the use of LinkedIn for professional networking. And then we wanted to ask governments about non-private tools, right? So we looked at this tool that's called GovLoop. GovLoop was designed as basically like Facebook, LinkedIn for government employees. It's not been adopted much by government agencies. So these boxes represent 10 cities. So only 50 cities in our sample use this program. And this may seem sort of irrelevant, but when you look at these other two tools, right, these are broad commercial tools that essentially, you know, the bulk of our government managers say that they use, but the tools that are actually designed for government work, they're not using for a variety of reasons. We find that various kinds of website features are more common in the US, right? Here's some data from 2010 to 2014. And we find that a lot of the advancements in technology use in cities are predicted on outsourcing technology applications. So in the cities we study, many of the cities use a private firm to design their websites. And so the cities that have outsourced their website design end up having much higher levels of accessibility, language translation. They have more functionality on their websites than cities that try to do this work in-house. And most of this is because these private firms use templates, right? And they just jam the city design into a template. The second major finding from our research is that public managers in the US really matter for technology enactment, that they play a key role in determining what gets used and what the sort of uptake is of that technology use. So managers are increasingly using technology for what we would call kind of internal work activities. So this we define in the survey as collaboration tools, sharing tools, and coordination tools. So collaboration tools would be, for example, using Dropbox to work on files together, using any sort of platform where multiple people can go in and work on the platform together. So you'll see here from this visualization, right, the proportion of respondents from the police department, Parks and Rec, and the mayor's office who report using these tools really essentially more than doubles, right? It triples from 2012 to 2016. So they're starting to use more internet-based electronic tools to collaborate with people in their organizations and within the city government. They're also using these tools much more to share information and data. And so these sharing tools might be sharing across government agencies within the city, but also then sharing with state government, federal government, and also like nonprofits and private sector partners. We also see a really big increase in coordination tools. So coordination tools would be, you know, Google Calendars, systems where you're coordinating contractors and different stakeholders to engage in like a city meeting or to build a new light rail in town, right? So again, we're seeing this sort of really big increase in agencies or government managers in the United States using technology to sort of get their jobs done internally. We also ask a lot of questions about using technology to engage the public, right? So civic participation kind of stuff. And that's more in the paper you read for this week. But what we find in our research is that there are 6 pretty consistent predictors of technology adoption, use, enactment, and successful implementation. The first being city population. So in the United States, bigger cities are better at using technology. And this is basically just a proxy for capacity, right? The larger the city population, typically the larger the government, which also means a larger budget for managing technology. They're more likely to have people with more technological expertise. In smaller communities, you're more likely to have one person running the website and you doing all the social media, right? Form of government is a pretty consistent predictor. So in the United States, we have two predominant types of city government, a mayor who is like a political official, and then a political city council. And then the other form is where we have a manager council, where we have a mayor who essentially is like the Queen of England. It's like a formal figurehead, but they don't have any legislative power. A city council, and then the city council hires a city manager. The city manager is actually sort of running the operations of government. It's a professional bureaucrat. So these cities that have this manager council form of government are much more likely to use technology for both civic engagement internally, essentially because they're more professionalized governments versus the sort of mayor council model, which is all elected officials and politicians. Department type predicts technology use. Police departments in the US, as you would probably imagine, are the most technologically advanced, partly because they get more money than everyone else, and second, because there is more top-down control of data collection and data sharing. So they tend to have a lot more data reporting to the federal government. They also get a lot of money from the federal government or state government, which is contingent on data collection and sharing. They're more likely to use performance metrics for allocating raises and budgets and things like that. So they tend to be a little bit more technologically advanced than, say, Parks and Recreation or the finance department. Technical capacity in the agency predicts technology use, which seems obvious. Resources, cities that have more money do more advanced technology. And then finally, management. So these are consistent predictors in every paper I've written with every year of these data sets. And I think that most of the e-government research would tell you that this is true. But I think one of the takeaways is that most of those predictors aren't things that cities can really do anything about, right? Telling a city that their population is positively related to their technology isn't sort of an actionable item for a manager, like, oh, well, let's just go increase our population, right? Form of government is very hard to change. Obviously, agencies can't change their mission and their type. And technology capacity and resources are sort of driven by budgets, which often managers don't have a lot of power over. And so we've become more interested in understanding this sort of role of managers, right? If individual managers can predict technology outcomes and can really affect outcomes, that's where a government could really make a difference in how it sort of hires and who they put in charge and how they empower leaders could really affect sort of technology outcomes for citizens and for employees within the organization. So some of the papers I've written more recently with the data set really try to understand the role of management and how individual managers can drive technology outcomes. We find that managerial perceptions of technology are really important for predicting uptake. If they don't believe a technology is useful, if they have negative views about social media or public engagement on platforms, they're much less likely to use these technologies effectively in their organizations. We find also that managerial sort of personal use of technology matters. So the more comfortable managers are using technology in their personal time, the more likely they are to effectively use it in the organization. This, of course, then ties into a lot of sort of generational differences and age differences, right? Younger managers are more likely to use technology effectively. They're more likely to adopt technology, but then have sort of a good sense of how to use the technology effectively. And so we find that these managerial perceptions really matter for all of these types of things: work-life balance, social media use, data use, collaboration, participation, data access, entrepreneurial orientation, right? So these are essentially all things that are related to managerial motivation and perception in technology use, which I think sort of the big takeaway being that it's really important to think about the role of managers when we're studying technology, especially in a very decentralized system like US government. One of the sort of more current things I'm thinking about a lot, because I'm seeing it in our data and we haven't done a very good job of asking questions about, is the ways in which politics matter for technology enactment. So what explains sort of if cities use social media tools and how? So one of the, here's like an example of politics mattering, right? So this is Twitter adoption across our sample of cities from 2007 to 2017. So you can see that the cities sort of start with very few Twitter accounts, and then it picks up quite quickly. And one of the things we find in our Twitter adoption, right, is that federal policy was actually the primary predictor of Twitter account adoption. So in 2009, Barack Obama was president of the United States, and he posted this memorandum on transparency and open government. And he argued that governments across the United States needed to be more transparent and open. And in response to that, all of these cities in early 2009 adopted Twitter accounts as a form of open government and transparency, right? So we can argue that that's not what Obama was aiming for, but it created this huge uptick in adoption across the United States, which really shows the importance of sort of political signaling for different technology use. But one of the things that also we find in the data is that this Twitter adoption didn't actually result in enactment or engagement of any form. So here you see the 500 cities that are in Twitter, right? So there's 500. 439 of the cities adopted Twitter. So that is blue. So the blue cities are Twitter adopters. When we did sort of a content analysis of these cities, we found that 36 of the Twitter accounts had never done anything. They were completely inactive. And over 250 of them only tweeted once and never tweeted again. And then the remaining cities, when they did tweet, it was simply to sort of post event information, to basically say there will be a city council meeting on Monday at 5 o'clock. That they weren't being used as sort of interactive technologies to engage the citizens of these communities. So we also then looked at data portals, which are used as a really useful indicator of open government. There are 191 of the 500 in our sample, right? So that's 40% have open data portals. But it's been really difficult for us to assess the content of these data portals and also how much they're used. So it seems that the bulk of the data portals, that's my warning, the bulk of the data portals that we've looked at don't have much data in them, or the data that are in the portals are not useful. They're not constructed in a way that a user could could use them to actually understand anything about government. And also the governments that we have talked to tell us that they don't collect any data on who's using the portal, right? So on the back end, they're not assessing the usefulness of the data portals that they have. So this points to some of the things that's really missing in the scholarship that we've done so far, which is sort of really understanding how useful these transparency and open data programs are for citizens and for governments. But one of the things I've been thinking about a lot lately is we sort of looked at the e-government literature and we said there needs to be more focus on managers. So I've done this 10-year study where we've really sort of, I think, gotten a good handle on the ways in which individual managers can affect technology outcomes in the US. But what we haven't done is looked at political factors very much. And I think that public administration scholars tend to not look at politics as much as we should. I don't know if this is partly in the United States because we broke away from political science departments, and so it's like a resistance. But also there's been a huge movement in feminist technology studies and critical theory and technology studies and digital humanities in the US scholarship that's really moved forward a lot of critical thinking about technology and society. And I would argue that the bulk of the e-government literature is silent on these fronts, that we don't really talk about or integrate these other ways of thinking about technologies. So for example, social media tools are designed by private firms for profit, right? We all know this. Facebook was designed to rate the attractiveness of women on college campus, right? Twitter is designed basically as an advertising sort of media platform. And these technological tools aren't really designed for public good production, right? Or for government services. So civic engagement, for example, is really hard to do. Governments know it's really hard to do. Why would public managers think that Twitter would make civic engagement easier to do, right? In some ways, it probably just makes it even harder for governments. And so I would sort of, I'm going to skip forward a little because I'm almost to the end. I would really be interested in sort of more assessments in e-government literature that are really trying to understand the use of platforms that are not designed for public service, but are being used for public service outcomes, particularly in the civic participation literature. I would also be interested in seeing more, I think, deep thinking about what kinds of technologies governments should be using and how to get those platforms designed in a way that they're useful for government work. I think it's really important that as scholars, we think a lot more critically about the intent and the political nature of the technology itself. So this goes back to some of the old science and technology studies where we think about technologies as having politics, right? That they're not just neutral tools that are put into good or negative use, but that technologies themselves have sort of a political nature, and it's important to think about those. I also think that management and politics really matter and work together in creating public outcomes. And a lot of the public administration literature ignores or treats politics as sort of a single variable in a model, like, oh, they're conservative or they're liberal, rather than really thinking about the way in which political context shapes how we think about technologies and sort of the broader outcomes of those technologies. I think there's a lot of opportunity for comparative research, particularly when you think about China as being one of the most advanced governments using technology for public outcomes, right? But those public outcomes are driven by politics, but also the data surveillance and collection environment is culturally quite different than it is in, say, the United States or Germany. And so I think that these are really important questions for thinking about technology governance. So to conclude, the research I've done, right, which I've just sort of swept over the last 10 years, really concludes that US governments are falling behind, that managers matter a lot for technology enactment in these sort of decentralized government systems, and I think have brought me to really concluding that we need a much deeper engagement with the political and social construction of technologies in public administration research. So with that, I think I'm done exactly on time.